Those of you who are long-term fans of Unsung Heroes will have probably noticed that I have kind of a soft spot for mad minivans. There's just something inherently crazy to me about this big family-oriented box with no real connection to performance going way faster than it really should, because some wacky tuning company or brand just decided to do it. There are fast SUVs and fast trucks as well, but those aren't too surprising, usually. It kind of makes sense. With the minivan, though, it just looks weird. And of course, there are some prime examples of that within this same series. One of the earliest episodes we ever did was the Citroen Zara Picasso Cup. More recently, one of my favourite examples, the Ital-designed Columbus, and of course, the Lamborghini Genesis by Bertone. Even outside of the series, though, you've got stuff like the Vauxhall Zafira VXR, the Mercedes R63 AMG in the production world, a couple of the very few examples of production high-performance minivans, in fact, and probably the single most famous and possibly most respected fast minivan of all time, of course, the gold Renault Espace F1. In this episode, however, I am talking about a vehicle which I believe deserves to be a new inductee, albeit from the early 90s, within that discussion. And I think that one of the reasons why it's probably not already is because it's easy to forget the name. It doesn't have an easy to remember title like Columbus or Espace. It's called the Parcours, from a brand called De La Chapelle. It doesn't exactly sound like a minivan, it sounds more like some classy show car of some kind, and funnily enough, De La Chapelle, an independent French brand, incidentally, got their start in more that kind of vibe. Back in the early 70s, they were set up by a Xavier De La Chapelle, who interestingly himself was a former director of Venturi, one of my favourite French brands, and they set up this company, De La Chapelle, building kind of recreations of classic Bugattis. Kind of a kit car sort of vibe, if you will. However, on a couple of occasions, in 1988 and 1998 most notably, they turned their attention to something more distinctly them. And in 1998 it was the De La Chapelle Roadster, which reminds me quite a lot actually of the Hummel Berlinette, also from France. And in 1988 they began development of this car, the Parcours. Now the car was finished, if you will, between 1990 and 1991, and unlike a lot of these crazy minivans, it actually is not just a one-off concept. In fact, they built 3 of them. And unlike the Renault Espace F1 and a couple of others, it wasn't intended just to flex their muscles or be an anniversary car of some kind or a wacky concept. This was a specific customer order. Now, as I alluded to, they began developing this car in 1988, and the 3 different versions actually had different engine setups. Now, as far as I could find, all 3 cars had a tubular frame with a 4-speed automatic gearbox, but the original version, the first one, which was a pure test car, had a Jaguar-sourced 5.3-litre V12. Now, that's a really impressive engine, but it wasn't the most powerful thing around. 273 horsepower, 304 pound-feet of torque. After that car, though, they developed the second version, a pre-series model closer to actually being produced, and this one swapped from the Jaguar V12 to a Mercedes V8. A smaller engine with less cylinders, of course, but more power and better performance. It was a 5-litre V8, 32-valve, 326 horsepower, 325 pound-feet of torque. So better numbers across the board. Top speed went from 230 kilometers an hour to 240. So in other words, from just over 140 miles an hour to 150. A 150 mile an hour minivan, again, in 1990. That is pretty phenomenal performance from a minivan. In fact, even by today's standards, that's quicker than the Vauxhall Zafira VXR from, 20 years later? So, for a car of its time that looks like it has the aerodynamics of a brick, it's doing pretty well. Now, of course, it's got that big, powerful engine on its side, but even so, for an early 90s performance car of any kind, 150 miles an hour was getting into some pretty impressive territory. Now, here's the interesting thing. The reason why the car was so good is because the aerodynamics are actually very impressive. In fact, it had a drag coefficient of 0.28. And to put that into perspective and give it some context, that's actually the same drag efficiency as the Audi e-tron from only a couple of years ago. That's, again, very impressive stuff, especially from this kind of obscure little French brand that had done nothing like this before. And it was this second vehicle, incidentally, which was shown at the Geneva Motor Show in 1992. Now that brings us to the third car. Now, it was this third car in particular, which incidentally had a lot in common with that second vehicle, including the Mercedes engine, that was the only one of the three that was allowed on the street and approved for road use. This one was the car which was essentially going to be the delivery upon the customer request for, incidentally, a foreign client who had requested the vehicle. Now, I don't know if they planned a mass production for the client or more of a one-off, and I'm not sure whether or not it got to the client. It seems hazy online as to whether it did, so if you have information on that, then by all means slap it down below. But the car seems to have kind of gone quiet after that. Now, to touch once again on the topic of the car's spec, we've discussed the great engines, the really good aerodynamics, the tube frame, and also I believe I mentioned the weight, which is incidentally 2.2 metric tons, which even in its own right is very impressive. But interestingly, it was designed to have between 6 and 8 seats. Again, more than enough practicality, of course at a higher rated, more luxurious and classier interior than most minivans would have had at the time. It was 17.5 feet long, so not crazy big, but certainly big enough, and it could return a quoted 15 miles per gallon. The aerodynamics certainly were a major part in why it could even achieve that kind of fuel economy. But as far as this car's story goes, it basically seems to, for the most part, end there. Now, I'm sure there's somebody online or somebody who knows someone who worked on the car who could give more information down in the comments as to where this vehicle or vehicles ended up. And from some of the images online, it seems like they were still in circulation for many years after, but it's curious that the project just kind of went away after that. It's weird because the car doesn't seem to have had any particular drawback or failure. The performance was good, the aerodynamics are fantastic, the practicality certainly wasn't bad, and for all intents and purposes, it seemed like they basically finished the project. So maybe it was just sold to the intended customer and the initial 2 prototypes were abandoned maybe. I can't say for sure. It is interesting though that the story just kind of goes quiet from what I could find after that. Either way though, regardless of what happened to the vehicle and its prototypes, it's still a very fascinating car. Great performance from an unsuspecting little brand who you typically wouldn't think of at all for making something like this, and although it's not quite as quick of course as a Renault Espace F1 for example, it's still very fast by minivan standards. In fact, it is still quicker than the actual production Vauxhall Zafira VXR, which is one of the fastest minivans you can actually buy. Overall though, I find it a fascinating car. The looks will probably divide opinion, so tell me your thoughts down below on the Parcours, and of course if you're new to Unsung Heroes, be sure to click the playlist on screen to check out the previous episodes and jump over to the Discord chat down below if you want to vote on this car as one of your favourites. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.